I like people. And I didn't always. I learned it. Yeah, I used to be more judgmental, but now I like people. I learned it from my father-in-law, who's just passed on, who was the world's super salesman, and he loved people. And I watched him. For example, he would say, "Hey, Bob, I'll meet you in the bar at 7. So I go down there at 7. At 7 o'clock, he knew everybody at the bar. He had met them all. He knew the names of their children. And so when I started liking people, life got better. Well, I grew up on an island called Long Island, and it's east of Manhattan. And I was born in Brooklyn, which is at the western end of Long Island, and then we moved gradually out on the island. My grandmother and grandfather were on the waterfront in Brooklyn. Then my grandfather died, and so she got a job with the Waterfront Commission of New York, and whose job was to fight organized crime, the mafia. She was tough as nails, and I would say she was the strong figure in my youth. And every Friday she would come out to Long Island on the train, and she would bring cheesecake in a box, a box with a string tied in a bow, and then we would tear it open and eat the cake. So it was kind of interesting. She was a crime fighter, but the people who lived near us on Long Island, especially out on the end, were mafia. And so she managed to pull it off. But so one of my favorite stories is she and I had joined a banquet at the Elks Club. And my father was an elk. So we went to this Saturday night dinner. And the dinner was over, and she and I are sitting at the back of the room together, the two of us. And there's all these tables, with white tablecloth, and then tomato sauce spilled on each one. So they were all red and white. And in walks my Uncle Sam. And not really my uncle, but we called each other uncle, cousin. He's wearing a really great suit with open to the navel and bling hanging down, my Uncle Sam. And she leans over to me and she says, "He's killed 8 people that I know of." "Oh, Nanny, why didn't you tell me this sooner? I've been playing in his backyard with Cousin Ronnie for 20 years. And she said, "You have never been safer than when you were playing in Uncle Sam's backyard." Both my mother and father had tragedies early in their life that affected their whole life. In my father's case, he lost an eye at a baseball game. And that affected him greatly, because when World War II ramped up in the South Pacific, his 3 brothers went to fight in the South Pacific, but he couldn't. So he went to work for this gyroscope company, where he met my mother. She was working there too. So he was a gyroscope technician, which is a rank below engineer. But after 30 years of working in the same company, they finally called him an engineer and let him stay in the union as an engineer. And then he retired at the age of 50 and lived happily ever after for 36 more years. But in any case, when I was very young, we did electric trains. So you start with a 4x8 piece of plywood, you paint it green, and then you put tracks on it, and then you put a control to open the bridges, and the control was made of doodads that he brought home from work. Switches, lights, and wood. And so we built a control for the trains from all those pieces he brought home. But then in 8th grade, 1959, I had a new teacher, Mr. Gosier, and he encouraged me to do a class project to build a computer. So I took the remnants of the train system and built a computer Well, actually, Mr. Gosier called it a computer. I didn't call it a computer. And this box would add any number between 1 and 3 to any other number between 1 and 3. So there were 3 switches, and you would go click, click, and then it would go kick, and then it would light the correct light. So I submitted this as my 8th grade science project. And I'll always remember the grade I got. A, triple plus, H, superior. So that meant I was going to go into science, and just to get more of those. Well, my dad tried to be an entrepreneur, and he and his 2 buddies started a company to repair this new technology called television. And it was Bailey, Abramson, and Metcalfe. BAM Electronics. And he brought some of the broken TVs home, and he had a basement bench, and so I was playing down there one day, and he came home at 5:30, as he always came home at 5:30. I was unconscious on the floor because I had reached in, and in those days the TVs had a high voltage line in them, and I found it, and it knocked me out. So he took all the TVs back to work, and so that he wouldn't endanger his family. It was a long time ago, so who knows if it's really true, but I think it's true, and it was probably a Sunday night before school, and I had to do a book report. And I hadn't read any books. So I went down into my dad's workshop, and he had some books on the shelf. And I looked, and I picked one off the shelf, and it was an electrical engineering textbook written by 2 MIT professors. So I took the book and thumbed through it, and then I wrote the normal fake book report. This book had its high points and it had its low points, but it was really interesting. And then I wrote, I plan to go to MIT and get a degree in electrical engineering. And I put that in there because I knew my teacher would love that, and I wanted to appeal to her. And but then the die had cast. I had committed to go to MIT in 4th grade, and then I later did. And I got a degree in electrical engineering, just as I had forecast. That's a little weird. My parents had 2 goals. One is that their kids go to college, and the other one is that he retire. And he did retire at age 50 and lived for 36 years. And I went to college. But it was a little awkward because my parents had no idea what it was like to go to college. And on Long Island, there is a college called Stony Brook, which if you live on Long Island, you go for free. And then there was MIT up in Boston, which they charged tuition, $1,700 tuition, which is nothing. So my parents said, well, you go to Stony Brook for free. But if you go to MIT, we're going to have to pay $1,700 a year. And I threw a fit, and they, to their credit, let me go to MIT. But I do remember when I got the acceptance letter, you were admitted. Congratulations, you're admitted. I thought some sort of mistake had been made, some arithmetic, some administrative error. Because there was nobody around me who had ever gone to college or knew what it was like. So then the next September, I left Long Island forever and went to MIT. I took all the interesting courses you could take in high school early, so I really finished after my junior year. And I got admitted to MIT my junior year in high school. But the advice I got from everybody was, don't go, enjoy your 12th year. So I did, and so I took a lot of courses that I would not have taken, like typing. I took a typing course, but I also took a drafting course, and so 2 of them. And so I learned to draw things and letter them and get perspective and so on. So then in the course of that, I said, yeah, I want to be an architect. And I fell in love with Frank Lloyd Wright, famous architect. I want to be just like him. I loved the way his buildings looked. So when I was interviewed for various schools applying, I would tell them I wanted to major in architecture. And MIT has the first architecture school in America. So it's quite good. So I got admitted to MIT, after having told everybody I was going to major in architecture. But MIT lets you major in any course you want. You get admitted to MIT, and then over time you decide what you want to major in. So I went to the first architecture class, and the first assignment was draw your own hand. Well, a hand doesn't have like perspective and straight lines and stuff, and I could not draw my hand. So at the end of the first week, I dropped the course and switched to math in 1 week. And then eventually I got tired of math and I switched to physics. And then I got tired of physics, especially because one of my professors started showing up drunk. And that annoyed me about physics, so I dropped physics and I went into management, where I eventually got a degree. And then at the very end, my father learned that I was going to get a degree in management. Now, have I mentioned that he was a union member? The opposite of union is management. So when he heard I was going to get a degree in management, he said, "We didn't send you to MIT to get a degree in management." So I stayed a 5th year and got my EE degree from MIT because he didn't like the management degree. But I got a management degree too, so that was 5 years at MIT. Well, I was a member of a fraternity, and one of my big brother, Jack Hatchett Turner, said that Bob, if you take this course, 6-251, I can get you a job at Raytheon that pays well. And my parents were paying for my tuition, so I wanted to stop that. So I took 6-251, and he got me a job at Raytheon. I started my sophomore year, and I worked every day from midnight to 8. So I would come into Boston Raytheon was a half hour out of town, so I would come in from Raytheon and drive to MIT and go to class. And I believe I'm proof that you can learn while you're asleep, like this. So yes, I worked full time. And I think I learned more with the various jobs I had than I learned at MIT. I had a bunch of different jobs. It was Raytheon, and then there was, let's see, NASA, the Laboratory for Nuclear Science, Charles Adams Associates Consulting Company. But then I starting my own companies. So I started Data Concepts Design, and then I started Management Decision Systems. Management Systems Consulting, and then I started Professional Data Services. And these were consulting companies that lasted about a year each. And I spent more time choosing the stationery than I did working at those companies. It was, yeah. I had played tennis in high school. And so then when I came to MIT, I went out for tennis as a freshman team and made it. And then I started playing varsity tennis. And I picked up squash my junior year, so you play squash in the winter and tennis in the spring. The only thing that kept me from being a professional tennis player is I was not good enough. It wasn't a career choice. Practice was every day from roughly 4 to 7. So I would go to tennis until 7, and then I would drive out to Raytheon out in Wayland and work until 8 the next morning. Then I would come back in and go to class, and then I would go to tennis. That was the orbit. I don't know when I slept. And I was really, as you could tell, super busy, but I had to turn in an undergraduate thesis. And so I went to one of my famous professors from whom I had taken courses, Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of artificial intelligence. And I got him to agree to be my undergraduate thesis advisor. And of course, the deadline loomed like the book report in 4th grade. I had to finish it. But I was playing tennis up in Maine with the varsity tennis team. So as we're driving back in the school bus, I'm writing this dissertation, which I then turned in the next morning. And he accepted it, so he signed off on it so I could graduate. But he didn't like it, I could tell. The title of the dissertation was a neuron model and some of its information processing capabilities. That would be a thesis you'd write today. Neuron models are the hot thing. So it paid to hang around Marvin. Anyway, Marvin and I don't think thought I was smart enough to be an AI person. So instead of hiring me, which would have been the normal thing, because he was growing the AI lab, instead of hiring me, he sent me down the hall to another professor, J.C.R. Licklider, where I got into the networking business instead of the AI business. And Licklider is the visionary behind the internet, starting in the 40s and 50s. So it was not a bad referral, it was very good. Well, in 1969, because I had been at MIT for 5 years, everyone told me I should change schools. And my then wife, was working at MIT, so my new school had to be in Boston. And if you're already at MIT and you have to change schools, there's only one place to go, Harvard. So I wasn't very careful, but I got accepted and immediately ran into trouble. Too much of an engineer, not enough of a mathematician. Harvard's kind of snobby about engineering. They look down on engineers, even today. So I was off on the wrong foot. But then I saw there was this device that needed building to connect Harvard to the ARPANET. And I had just finished taking all the courses on digital electronics and digital design and so on. So I was ready to build that box. So I told them that, and they rejected it. They said, you can't, no. It's much too important to give to a grad student. Well, that pissed me off. So I then went back down the Broadway to MIT at the other end of the Broadway, and I pitched a guy named Al Veza, who was Licklider's right-hand man, that I should build this device. So he hired me, like with pay and everything, to build that box. So then I go to Harvard and I say, hey, I'm building this box. MIT has said I can make a copy of it for you. And I said, no, we don't want it. It's too important to give to a grad student. But that was part of my long-term estrangement from Harvard University. And it's been 50 years, so it's probably time I forgive them. 3 years went by, and I did my work on the ARPANET at MIT. I wrote a thesis. I submitted it to Harvard. I invited my parents to come to graduation in June. I got a job at Xerox. My wife quit her job at MIT and got a job at Stanford. And then it was 2 weeks before graduation. It was time to defend my thesis, the oral defense. And so I drove up to Harvard and went into the room, and there was my committee, and I pitched them on my dissertation, and they rejected it. Whoa. So I had to call my parents. That was hard. And then, what do you mean you failed your own? What are you doing there? And so I called Xerox, who had made me a job offer, and I explained to Bob Taylor, who was my boss there, that I had failed. And he said, don't worry about it. Come on to Palo Alto and finish it here. Whew. That was great. Good old Bob Taylor. Right, I had connected MIT to the ARPANET internet. And so as soon as I got to Xerox Research in June of 1972, they said, put us on the internet. So I did exactly the same thing, slightly different hardware and stuff. And that took me, my first year, or less than that. But then it was announced that the lab was going to build what turned out to be the world's first modern personal computer. And of course, it would have to be networked. And we were also building the world's first high-speed laser printer. And so however we connected these PCs, they needed to be able to print on this printer, which is really fast. The printer is a page per second, 500 dots per inch. It just takes a lot of bits. So the normal networks would not work. So we needed a network to connect the PCs to the internet and also to this printer. And we looked around, who's Who's the networking guy? Oh, Bob's the networking guy. Bob, you build the network. And so I started out. First thing I did was to buy a spool of cable, about this big, about a mile long. Started sending pulses down, looking at the other end. What do the pulses look like at the other end? So this end, by the way, the pulses are square, like this. But at the end of a mile of cable, they're kind of smooshed. They're round. But not so smooshed that you couldn't recover them. You couldn't recover the data. And while I was doing that, in the basement of building 34, there was this Stanford graduate student, Dave Boggs, in the basement, and he saw me fumbling with the cable. And he came over to help, and we became partners, and we built the first Ethernet. Dave Boggs, may he rest in peace. And the Ethernet had the feature that it was very fast. It was 10,000 times faster than the network we had before. Did you hear me? 10,000 times faster. Whoa. And it could keep the printer busy. So Dave Boggs and I then proceeded to fill Xerox with a Xerox Internet. And then in 1979, I left Xerox to build an Internet outside and formed a company called 3Com, Computer Communication Compatibility, 3Com, aimed at selling products to connect computers together using open standards. And that was June 4th, 1979. David Boggs did not join my company, my co-inventor. Well, that's a bit of a rejection. I'm starting a company. Come on, let's go do it. No, I want to stay. He wanted to stay and continue doing research. So I found other people that would. A guy named Ron Crane replaced him, and he. So then we made a major strategic choice. It wasn't entirely voluntary. We decided to make Ethernet a standard. And so we created a standards body. We literally created a standards body called the IEEE 802. And that created a 2-year war among contending technologies, each vying to be standard in this committee. And then the committee, I'm being sarcastic now, the committee courageously standardized all 3 of the standards that had been submitted. And they let us fight it out in the marketplace, which we did. And Ethernet won. And then, 50 years later, I get the Turing Award. In the 50th anniversary year, you think somebody up there at ACM was saying, hey, that would be nice. This is the 50th year. What do you say we give Bob his long overdue Turing Award? In 1982-ish, we were selling networks to people with IBM personal computers, and there weren't any of those people. IBM had just announced their PC. So we made a $3,000 trial package with 3 cards. You plug the cards into your 3 PCs. Boom, boom, boom. You run a cable along the back, load up our software, and then you could attach a printer to any one of those PCs. And it became a printer for all of the PCs. It was shared. And there was a disk. You could put a disk on one of the PCs and then share this hard disk among all 3 of them. And you could send email among the 3 PCs. So we started selling this for $3,000. And after a while, the users said, this does exactly what you said it would do. It's just not useful. So then I was head of sales and marketing at that time. So it was up to me to figure out. It's pretty bad news when your customers don't think your products are useful. But I had to figure out why, and I did figure out why, and I made a slide. And the slide said that the cost of the network grows linearly as you buy cards, which cost $500, say. But the number of possible connections among n of these grows as the square. So it goes like this. And there's a crossover point here where the value exceeds the cost. So then I made 6 copies of that slide, 35 millimeters. There was no PowerPoint. That was years ahead. I made 6 slides. I inserted them into the carousel projectors of my 6 salespeople. And they went out and they told our customers, the reason that your network is not useful is because it's not big enough. So you need to buy more of our products. So that would be self-serving. But they did. And they got more value. And we went public shortly thereafter because our products started selling like hotcakes. So it was a very successful thing. So that was 1982, 83, 84. It became Metcalfe's Law in 1995 when George Gilder in Forbes magazine started referring to that slide as Metcalfe's Law. Selling is the secret sauce. It's the skill that we need. I didn't have it until they made me head of sales and marketing. I had to learn how to sell, and really quickly because the company was running out of money. But personal scientists need to sell. They need to sell their ideas. They need to sell themselves. They need to get hired. They need to give their papers and gather people to work with them on their projects. Now there's different kinds of selling, personal selling, and being the vice president of sales is different from being a salesperson. So I had to learn all the whole thing. At the end of the 2 years that I was head of sales, I was not competent to run sales. So we went out and recruited a professional salesperson. Well, delegation is another thing. It's very hard to do. But in order to scale your company, you have to delegate. You can't do everything yourself. And you can make lots of mistakes in delegation. Like undelegating is the classic mistake. You delegate and then you take it back. I'd like you to write this. I wrote this. Really upsets people, so don't do that. My company had for the second time chosen someone else to be the CEO. And it's really good practice pretty much for the previous CEO to get out of town. You don't want previous CEOs hanging around interfering with the new CEO's options. So at that point, I left the company. I retired from 3Com in January of 1990. And how did that happen? Oh, I became a visiting fellow at Cambridge, England. And while I was there, I got a phone call from a man named Pat McGovern, a billionaire publisher, publishers Computer World and Network World and Info World and 300 magazines. And he said he wanted to make me publisher of one of his magazines. And actually, he wanted me to be the CEO. I wanted to be the publisher. And he said, no, you don't want to be the publisher. Publishers are ad salespeople. They go to Madison Avenue and they sell ads. That's not the right thing. I said, well, Pat, I want to be the publisher. So he made me CEO, chairman, CEO, and publisher of InfoWorld, where I immediately realized I had made a mistake. Because there I was selling ads on Madison Avenue to people who didn't care that I had invented Ethernet. They just wanted to know how many, what my circulation was. And so I learned how to sell advertising as the publisher CEO of InfoWorld, which I did for 4 years. So I had a superstar editor, Stuart Alsop. And so we became partners, publisher, editor. And one day he came into my office and says, I need you to write a column, a publisher's column. And I knew what that was. It was about the magazine by the publisher, bragging about a new format or something. So I started writing a publisher's column. And then a month later, Stuart came in and said, I don't want you to write a publisher's column anymore. I want you to write a real column. Okay? So that made things complicated because Pat McGovern, aforementioned, believed in the separation of church and state. That advertising and editorial, I wasn't allowed on the 7th floor of my own building because that's where the editors were. And since I sold ads, I was not allowed on the 7th floor. But I'm writing this column, and it got me in a lot of trouble. I would savage some huge company, and then the next day I'd go and try to sell them an ad. And they remembered what I wrote the day before. So eventually I had to become only a columnist, and I stopped being publisher, CEO. Well, this is a weekly column with 1 million readers. 1 million in 90 countries. I mean, I was syndicated. So every Thursday night was a big event because I had to produce 605 words that would be on the next Monday morning would be read by 1 million people. And we knew it was 1 million people because we surveyed the hell out of them. So it was a big job. And it was controversial. I'm writing a column. Do I want to be right or do I want to be interesting? And I usually chose interesting. That's how you get 1 million readers. You be interesting. And so one Thursday night, I predicted that the internet would collapse in the next year. And I had some evidence that it would because I had tools from my old company, and I could look in the internet and I could see the packets being dropped. The internet, the World Wide Web was accelerating more rapidly than expected. So the traffic was higher than expected, and the packet loss rate had exceeded 25%, which is a dangerous number. So I had some basis for predicting a collapse. So I predicted a specific collapse called the gigalapse, 1 billion lost user hours in a single outage. And I predicted it for the year 1995, one of those, or 6, one of those. And it didn't collapse. Well, it did, but not that big. It was actually 118 megalapse, which is a factor of 8 below a gigalapse. So I was only off by a factor of 8. But my readers were brutal, and they demanded, they wanted blood for this. So I had made the promise in 1995 that I would eat my column if I was wrong, and I said this to the World Wide Web Conference, 1,000 bloodthirsty web people. And then 97 came, and there hadn't been a gigalapse. And so I went back to that same conference in Santa Clara. There were 1,000 people there, and they all remembered. And they made me eat the column. So I came to the conference a day early, and I got my column, and I tried to eat it. You can't, I checked. I called the company. The inks were soybean inks, not heavy metals, so they weren't going to kill me. And then I tore off a piece and started to eat it, and you can't eat paper. You can't. It's too hard. It doesn't crunch. So I had a problem. So that's why I ran out and got a blender. I had a piece of cake made before that looked like my column, but it was a piece of cake, a big bit like this. So here I am facing these 1,000 bloodthirsty web people. And I said, I was really right about 1996. The internet did collapse. The audience booed and murmured. And I said, okay, here's the column. And I brought the cake out, and I started cutting it into pieces and serving it to the people in the front row. And once again, the audience started murmuring and booing. And so finally, I had to eat the column. So I went behind the podium, pulled out the blender, poured the water into it, tore up the column. I showed everybody that I had the column, tore it up, put it in the blender, blended, and then drank it. And I got more publicity from that stunt than ever before. It was fabulous. But I made lots of predictions, some even more obnoxious than that one. I had decided to attack open source software. That is like attacking open source. It was a stupid decision. I should not have done it. But their virtue signaling was just horrible. So I attacked open source, and they came after me on that occasion too. I only have standard things to say about failure. It's no fun at all. If you can avoid failing, avoid it. But inevitably you will fail. You should fail, but then you don't use that word. Failing becomes learning. You have to turn it into a learning experience rather than a failing experience. What happened here? Why did it go badly? And if you do that, then it's not, you don't take it personally. It doesn't damage you as much. Yeah. Yeah, so you should plan on failing a lot and not taking it personally. So when I played varsity squash at MIT, this was one of my winning techniques. There's this classic thing where your opponent makes a mistake and the ball hits the tin and they lose the point. And the weak players get all upset and they throw their racket and they yell and they scream, guaranteeing that they're going to lose the next point. And I trained myself when I made a mistake to focus on winning the next point, not throwing my racket in an infantile outburst. So being ready to fail and then having it not end the world, and learning from it. So I wasn't always married. I'd been married for 43 years, but I was single for a while. And every once in a while, my girlfriend would throw me over. And people like me then become suicidal because they've been rejected by the love of their life. But I didn't do that. I suddenly became focused on proving her wrong. It was a very motivating thing to do. So that's another way of recovering from failure, is revenge. You know, revenge is very powerful stuff. I'll get back at them. I once wrote a recommendation for my daughter for high school, and I really liked what I wrote. I wrote, I'd like my daughter to be the kind of person who makes enemies. And they accepted her anyway. So there are some people that you have to have be your enemies, not gratuitously, but they just make it impossible for you to be anything other than their enemy. And I have a list of them. I was interviewing a company for my column, and there was another person in the room, Mike, and Mike was a VC. So he invited me back to his VC firm and suggested I should become a VC. And it had been 8 or 9 years, so it was time for me to change. So I left IDG, the International Data Group, the publisher, and became a venture capitalist, a Polaris partner in those days, Waltham, Massachusetts. We had $4 billion to invest, and there were 12 of us. We met every Monday morning, and we made our investments over, in my case, a 10-year period. And it was great. The good part was when the companies would show up and give you their first pitch, and they told you what they were doing, and you could sense their enthusiasm, and you might even admire their technology. But then most of the time you had to say no when it came time to invest, and that was really hard and painful. So the joy of seeing the first presentation and the misery of having to turn them down, 1 out of 10 we accepted roughly. I have a superpower. I listen. I listen really well. That's my secret of success, listening. And if you're going to listen, you got to stop talking. It seems too easy. Listening, that seems easy. Oh no, listening is an art. For example, when I listen, I like to write things down. A lot of times these entrepreneurs or scientists come and they talk to you and they don't write anything down. It's insulting. You mean I said nothing worthwhile for you to write down? So that's one of the listening techniques, is to write things down, which is a compliment to the person you're dealing with. And plus, you know you can remember what they said. I became the fellow of free enterprise at the University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, and I did that for 11 years, and then it was time to move on to my new career. And then I got a job at MIT in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence lab to begin my practice of computational engineering. So my second project is geothermal wells, and I'm working to simulate geothermal drilling. But my first project is to go all the way back to Ethernet, 50 years ago. And we were in a rush to build Ethernet. And so there's this place way inside of Ethernet where we didn't have time to get it all worked out, so we just assumed it would work. And I want to go back. I have started to go back to nail that down, that algorithmic connection, which we didn't have time to explore fully.